Remember when trade disputes were boring news that didn't affect your daily life? Those days are over. America just hit China with a staggering 145% tariff, economic punishment not seen since the trade wars that worsened the Great Depression. China immediately fired back with 125% tariffs and banned American films from their theaters. The consequences are already hitting Canadian homes and businesses. Major auto parts manufacturers are shifting production overseas, retail prices for electronics and household goods are jumping 15 to 30%, and financial analysts are warning of a coming recession as global trade contracts by up to 7%. This isn't just another political disagreement, it's a fundamental restructuring of the economic world order. What happens when a 40-year-old Canadian auto parts factory suddenly shuts down? Last month, Windsor's Maple Leaf Manufacturing closed its doors after 4 decades, leaving 340 workers jobless without warning. The morning shift arrived to find padlocked gates and a simple notice. Operations permanently terminated effective immediately. Some employees had spent their entire working lives at that plant, only to be left standing in the parking lot, clutching thermoses of coffee they'd never get to drink on their coffee break. This isn't just another factory closure in a long line of manufacturing decline. It's the first visible tremor of an economic earthquake hitting Canadian soil, triggered by events thousands of kilometers away. The earthquake's epicenter, Washington, D.C., where the decision to implement a massive 145% tariff on Chinese goods set off seismic waves that are now reaching Windsor, Ontario. At the hastily arranged press conference, Maple Leaf's CEO Mark Jennings cited unsustainable cost increases in their supply chain as the reason for the closure. But what's remarkable is that not a single Canadian news headline connected the dots to the real cause. Not one mentioned the tariffs that made this factory's business model impossible almost overnight. The truth lies in the supply chain numbers. Maple Leaf sourced 60% of its raw materials from Chinese suppliers, specialized steel alloys, electronic components, and composite plastics that now cost nearly 2.5 times more due to America's new tariff regime. Those once affordable materials have become financial poison to Canadian manufacturers. Here's where things get particularly painful for Canadian businesses. When those materials cross into Canada, they bring the tariff burden with them, creating what economists call a tariff pass-through effect. Even though Canada hasn't imposed these tariffs, our manufacturers who rely on global supply chains are getting crushed by the weight of American trade policy. We explored every possible alternative, explained Jennings in the company's statement. Sourcing from other countries would require complete retooling at a cost of $18 million. Absorbing the increased costs would mean operating at a 27% loss. There was simply no viable path forward. Windsor sits in a particularly vulnerable position. 1 in 4 jobs in the region depends on auto manufacturing, and research from the Windsor-Essex Economic Development Corporation shows 70% of local parts makers source components from China. The math becomes simple and devastating. When a critical input suddenly costs 2.5 times more, businesses either pass those costs to customers who look elsewhere, or they shut down. The impact goes far beyond the 340 workers directly affected. Each manufacturing job supports approximately 3.5 additional jobs in the community, from the restaurants where workers eat lunch to the shops where they spend their paychecks. When we talk about 340 jobs lost, we're really talking about over 1,500 livelihoods suddenly at risk in a single community. Local economic experts are already sounding alarm bells. Dr. Natasha Reynolds from the University of Windsor's Economics Department predicts 12 to 15 similar closures across Ontario's manufacturing belt by year's end if the tariff situation continues. What we're seeing is just the first domino, she warns. The integration of North American supply chains means these tariffs don't stop at the American border. The closure of Maple Leaf manufacturing represents something more ominous than just one failed business. It's the canary in the coal mine, signaling a fundamental shift in the economic landscape for Canadian manufacturers caught in the crossfire of a trade war they didn't start and can't influence. But to understand why this single factory closure is just the beginning of Canada's economic challenge, we need to unpack what this 145% tariff actually means. The number itself requires explanation. It's not a simple single policy, but rather a layered accumulation of trade actions that have created a nearly impenetrable barrier to Chinese goods. The 145% includes a new 10% baseline tariff on all imports implemented by the current administration, plus a reciprocal 115% tariff specifically targeting Chinese goods across multiple industries, and an existing 20% tariff from previous trade actions. This compounding effect has created a virtual trade war that's restructuring global supply chains with remarkable speed. For companies like Maple Leaf, there's simply no time to adapt. While large multinational corporations might have the resources to rapidly reconfigure their supply networks, mid-sized Canadian manufacturers operate on margins too thin to absorb these shocks or invest in wholesale transformation of their business models. The human cost becomes painfully evident in Windsor's community centres, now hosting emergency job fairs for displaced workers. "I've got a mortgage and 2 kids in college," says former Maple Leaf machinist Dan Kowalski. "Where am I supposed to find another job that pays $38 an hour in this town? Everything's connected to auto parts." Quick pause. If you're enjoying this video, we'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe to the channel. Did you know over 88% of viewers watch without subscribing? Subscribing is free and it helps us create more content you love. So go ahead and hit that button. It only takes a second. Thanks so much, and now back to the video. As Dan Kowalski contemplates his uncertain future halfway across the world in Beijing, Chinese officials were already executing what internal documents reportedly call Operation Economic Encirclement. The shocking reality is that China's revenge for America's tariffs wasn't primarily aimed at the US at all. It was deliberately engineered to make countries like Canada pay the heaviest price. Within 48 hours of America's tariff announcement, China launched a counterattack so precisely targeted that economic analysts started calling it strategic economic warfare. But while American media outlets fixated on China's 125% reciprocal tariff, they completely missed the more devastating secondary responses that directly threaten Canadian livelihoods. You see, China didn't just match America's aggressive trade move. They deployed a sophisticated, multi-layered strategy specifically designed to exploit vulnerabilities in the North American Economic Alliance. And Canada, caught in the middle of this superpower showdown, is taking the most punishing blows. Take critical minerals, for instance. China immediately restricted exports of gallium and germanium, obscure elements most Canadians have never heard of, but absolutely essential for manufacturing the semiconductors that power everything from smartphones to military equipment. These restrictions hit Canada's growing tech sector particularly hard, as our semiconductor industry relies on these Chinese-sourced materials for production. Even more alarming is what happened to Canadian agriculture. Without warning, Chinese importers cancelled billions in pending orders of Canadian canola, soybeans and pork. This wasn't some coincidental business decision. These agricultural products represent over $8 billion in annual Canadian exports, and China specifically selected them to inflict maximum pain on Canadian farmers. This is a calculated move to pressure Canada, explains Dr. Elena Zhang, international trade specialist at the University of British Columbia. By targeting agricultural exports, China punishes rural communities that typically support pro-American trade policies. It's economic pressure designed to create internal division. The evidence that Canada was deliberately targeted comes straight from Chinese officials themselves. The Global Times, China's state-run media outlet, published an editorial explicitly stating that countries aligned with American trade aggression will face consequences, a thinly veiled threat aimed directly at Canada's export-dependent economy. And it didn't stop there. China then banned all American films from theaters and streaming services throughout the country, a move that seems unrelated to Canada until you understand that many major Canadian film productions are co-financed with American studios. This cultural boycott immediately threatened thousands of jobs in Canada's $9 billion film industry, with productions in Vancouver and Toronto already reporting financing pulled from Chinese investors. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is how China strategically calibrated its response to minimize self-harm while maximizing damage to North American supply chains. By restricting exports rather than imports of critical minerals, China maintains its dominant market position while creating supply shortages for Canadian and American manufacturers. This isn't just tit-for-tat tariffs anymore, warns former Canadian trade negotiator Melissa Chen. China is deploying tactical asymmetric responses that exploit specific vulnerabilities in different sectors of our economy. They're playing economic chess while we're stuck playing checkers. The impacts are already rippling through Canadian businesses. Quantum Computing Solutions in Waterloo, Ontario reported last week that their production line for next-generation processors now faces critical material shortages. Meanwhile, pork producers in Manitoba have seen futures contracts collapse as Chinese buyers vanish from the market. Perhaps most concerning is how China's retaliation creates divisive pressure within Canadian society. Rural agricultural communities that depend on Chinese exports now face devastating financial losses, while urban centres feel different economic impacts, creating regional tensions that further complicate Canada's political response. China understands that by forcing Canada to choose between its economic interests and its alliance with America, they create an impossible dilemma for Canadian policymakers, explains international relations professor Thomas Bergeron from McGill University. This is precisely how middle powers get squeezed in a superpower conflict. The retaliatory package even includes targeted visa restrictions on Canadian business travellers to China, effectively shutting down new business development opportunities for Canadian companies hoping to access the Chinese market. These restrictions specifically exempt European business travellers, creating competitive advantages for EU companies at Canada's expense. What's particularly clever about China's strategy is how they've created what economists call separation pressure, incentives designed to drive wedges between allies. While implementing harsh restrictions on Canadian exports, China simultaneously offered preferential access to Australian agricultural producers who face similar restrictions during previous trade disputes. The message is unmistakable. Countries that maintain neutrality in this trade war will be rewarded, while America's closest allies will suffer disproportionate consequences. It's a sophisticated approach to economic warfare that specifically targets the alliance structure America depends on. While China's strategy masterfully targets entire allied nations, the economic devastation isn't distributed equally within our borders. Behind closed doors, Canadian industry leaders are facing impossible choices as certain sectors stand on the precipice of collapse, while others may actually benefit from the shifting trade landscape. The government's public messaging about manageable economic adjustments sharply contradicts internal industry forecasts, showing several sectors facing extinction-level threats within months, not years. Canada's electric vehicle manufacturing ambitions have become the first major casualty. The country's highly publicized $10 billion EV investment strategy now hangs by a thread as battery component costs skyrocket under the new tariff regime. Thunder Bay's North Star Battery Technologies, which broke ground just 4 months ago on a $420 million factory, has already announced an indefinite construction pause while they reassess project viability. We can't produce competitive batteries when our input costs are 145% higher than our American competitors who secured domestic supply chains, explains North Star CEO Michel Tremblay. Our entire business model was built on accessing affordable Chinese cathode materials. Without that, we're dead in the water. The situation appears even more dire for smaller Canadian EV startups. Vancouver-based Electricity Motors, which planned to launch Canada's first domestically produced electric SUV next year, quietly filed for bankruptcy protection last week. Industry analysts estimate that 7 of Canada's 11 EV manufacturing initiatives face similar fates if the current tariff structure remains. Ontario's Semiconductor Corridor faces equally devastating prospects. The industry currently sources an astonishing 72% of its rare earth elements from China, materials now effectively priced out of reach for Canadian firms. While American competitors benefit from government subsidies offsetting these costs, Canadian chip makers receive no such support. We're watching a slow-motion industry collapse, warns Dr. James Chen, director of the Semiconductor Industry Association of Canada. Without immediate government intervention, we're looking at a complete elimination of domestic semiconductor production within 16 months. There's simply no mathematical path to profitability with these input costs. Meanwhile, agricultural exporters face what industry insiders call a perfect storm of market disruptions. Not only have they lost access to the lucrative Chinese market, but they're now competing domestically with artificially cheap American products diverted from China and dumped into Canada. Saskatchewan wheat farmer Grace Wilkins explains the devastating ripple effects. American producers who can't sell to China are flooding our market with grain priced below production costs. They can afford to do this temporarily because of US government subsidies. Canadian farmers get no such protection. We're being crushed from both sides. Perhaps most alarming is the emerging crisis in Canada's pharmaceutical sector. Industry reports reveal supply disruptions affecting 37 critical medications reliant on Chinese precursor chemicals. While hospital systems currently maintain adequate reserves, projections show potential shortages emerging by early next year. 6 of these medications have no viable production alternatives outside China, notes Health Canada's confidential risk assessment document, accidentally released during a recent press briefing. This includes 2 critical antibiotics and 1 cardiovascular medication prescribed to over 340,000 Canadians. Not all sectors face immediate demise, however. Domestic steel producers stand to temporarily benefit as construction companies seek alternatives to Chinese imports. Similarly, Canada's forestry sector anticipates short-term gains as Chinese wood products disappear from supply chains. We're seeing a 22% increase in orders since the tariffs took effect, confirms Jean Bouchard, CEO of Northern Timber Alliance. But this isn't sustainable prosperity, it's temporary relief in an otherwise chaotic market environment. What unites the most vulnerable industries isn't simply their size or economic significance, but rather a critical vulnerability factor deliberately omitted from government briefings: supply chain integration density. Industries with highly specialized, China-dependent supply chains and limited domestic alternatives face near-impossible adaptation challenges in compressed timeframes. This creates a troubling geographic dimension to the economic pain. While metropolitan areas with diversified economies may weather the storm, single industry communities face potential devastation. In Sault Ste. Marie, where 41% of jobs connect directly or indirectly to steel production, the community lives in constant fear of plant closure announcements. We're one corporate boardroom decision away from economic collapse, admits Mayor Thomas Findlay. Every morning I check my phone, dreading the news that our main employer is shutting down. The anxiety in our community is palpable. The political ramifications of this uneven impact are already emerging. Regions experiencing disproportionate economic harm are increasingly resentful of communities that remain relatively insulated. This geographic division threatens to create new fault lines in Canadian politics, with trade policy emerging as a major wedge issue in upcoming elections. Beyond these emerging political fault lines lies something far more personal, a direct assault on your household finances that no politician seems willing to acknowledge. The 145% tariff sounds like an abstract economic concept until you're standing in the checkout line wondering why everything suddenly costs so much more. What's truly alarming isn't just the price increases themselves, but the carefully orchestrated timeline retailers are using to introduce them. Your shopping receipts haven't spiked dramatically yet, but behind the scenes, Canadian retailers are already receiving waves of supplier notifications announcing imminent price hikes. I've spoken with 3 major electronics chain purchasing directors who confirmed they've received wholesale price increase notices ranging from 15% to 22% on virtually everything containing Chinese components, which, let's be honest, is almost everything electronic you own. We received supplier notifications for 74% of our inventory last week alone, explains Jamie Davidson, procurement manager at Canada's third largest electronics retailer. These aren't requests, they're mandates. We either accept the new pricing structure or lose access to the products altogether. These electronics chains are currently absorbing some costs while strategically planning price adjustments to coincide with fall shopping seasons. The clothing racks at your favorite stores tell a similar story. Retail clothing buyers report incoming price increases between 8 to 12% on apparel made with Chinese textiles. This affects an astounding 60% of all clothing imports to Canada. Fast fashion retailers who operate on razor-thin margins with rapid inventory turnover will be the first to implement these increases, with mid-range retailers following by late summer. The timing of these price adjustments follows predictable inventory cycles. Products with rapid turnover like fashion and electronics will show price hikes within 60 to 90 days, while durable goods with longer inventory cycles like appliances and furniture won't reflect the full increases until early next year. This creates a dangerous illusion that the economic impact isn't as severe as predicted until the second and third waves of price increases hit simultaneously. Perhaps nowhere will the sticker shock be more pronounced than at auto dealerships across Canada. Industry insiders confirm they're preparing for vehicle price increases ranging from $3,000 on base models to over $7,000 on premium vehicles. Electric vehicles face the steepest markup trajectory due to their dependence on Chinese battery components, potentially adding $9,000 to the already premium price points of electric models. We've never seen supplier cost increases of this magnitude implemented in such a compressed time frame, explains Darius Henderson, sales director at Markham Auto Group. Normally, price adjustments of 5 to 7% would be phased in over 18 months. We're looking at double that percentage in less than half the time. Even services, you might assume, are insulated from international trade dynamics, are affected. Home renovation costs are projected to rise 10 to 15% by year's end as building material suppliers pass along increased costs for Chinese-sourced components. Everything from wiring to fixtures, cabinet hardware to flooring materials will cost substantially more. Rebecca Zhang, a Toronto-based contractor, has already adjusted all her client quotes. I've had to include an unprecedented tariff adjustment clause in all new contracts that allows for additional costs if material prices surge beyond current projections. This has caused several homeowners to put renovation projects on indefinite hold. The cumulative impact on the average Canadian household budget will be substantial. Economic modelling from Desjardins projects that the average Canadian household can expect to pay between $1,800 and $2,400 more annually for consumer goods if current tariff structures remain in place. This breaks down with the highest increases in electronics, 15 to 30%, vehicles, 10 to 20%, and home improvement materials, 10 to 15%. These household budget increases couldn't come at a worse time. Canadians are already contending with persistently high inflation on essential goods, elevated interest rates constraining borrowing power, and wage growth that consistently trails behind rising costs. The latest Statistics Canada data shows the average Canadian household now allocates 36% of after-tax income to essential expenses, the highest percentage in over 2 decades. The most insidious aspect of these price increases is their uneven distribution across economic classes. Budget-conscious consumers who rely on lower-priced goods, which typically have higher Chinese component percentages, will face disproportionately steeper increases compared to premium shoppers who purchase European or North American brands with more diversified supply chains. Retailers themselves face an impossible dilemma. Absorbing these cost increases would decimate already thin profit margins, yet passing them fully to consumers risks devastating sales volume. Most are adopting a hybrid approach, absorbing some costs while implementing gradual price adjustments and in many cases quietly reducing product sizes or features without adjusting prices. Those retail pricing strategies represent desperate attempts to navigate surface-level impacts, But beneath them lurks a far more fundamental threat to Canada's entire economic model. For generations, we've built our national prosperity on a delicate balancing act, maintaining productive relationships with competing global powers while avoiding being forced to choose sides. That economic tightrope walk is suddenly becoming impossible as superpowers force middle-power nations into impossible choices in what political scientists have ominously named the G0 world. The term G0 was coined by political scientist Ian Bremmer to describe our current global reality, a power vacuum where no single nation or bloc can effectively lead the international system. Unlike the stable Cold War era with its predictable rivalry or the post-Soviet period of American dominance, today's G0 landscape features competitive powers creating economic chaos while international institutions grow increasingly powerless. For a trading nation like Canada, this shift has catastrophic implications. Our entire economic strategy has been built on leveraging our unique position as America's closest ally while simultaneously developing profitable trade relationships with emerging markets like China. This economic flexibility allowed Canada to benefit from American security guarantees while capitalizing on China's explosive growth, the perfect position for a resource-rich middle power. The former Canadian ambassador to China, David Mulroney, describes our previous strategy as principled pragmatism, maintaining core values while recognizing economic reality. For decades, Canada flourished by maintaining constructive engagement with both Washington and Beijing, Mulroney explains. We could disagree with China on human rights while still selling them lumber. We could challenge American steel tariffs while still being their defense partner. That world has vanished almost overnight. The collapse of this balanced approach began accelerating in 2018 with the Huawei crisis, but has now reached critical mass with the tariff war. Canadian diplomatic cables recently obtained through access to information requests reveal alarming conversations with both superpowers. In a closed-door meeting last month, US Trade Representative Catherine Tai reportedly told Canadian officials that neutrality is no longer an option and warned that failure to reduce Chinese economic entanglements could result in Canada facing secondary tariff considerations. Bureaucratic language for economic punishment. Simultaneously, Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce Wang Wentao explicitly told a Canadian trade delegation that countries must decide whether they want prosperity or allegiance to a declining power, making crystal clear the consequences of alignment with Washington. He specifically referenced Australia's painful economic isolation after criticizing China in 2020, noting that Canada's economy is significantly more vulnerable to market access disruptions. This diplomatic squeeze creates an impossible dilemma for Canadian policymakers: align with America and lose access to the world's fastest-growing consumer market, along with affordable manufacturing inputs. Side with China and risk devastating tariffs from our largest trading partner and closest ally. Attempt neutrality and potentially suffer punishment from both sides. What makes this situation particularly dangerous is the timing. The USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA, comes up for its first major renegotiation in 2026. This gives American negotiators enormous leverage to demand Canada reduce Chinese economic ties as a condition for continued preferential access to the US market, access that represents 75% of Canada's exports. Foreign policy expert Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa warns that Canada faces uniquely severe consequences in this fragmented economic order. Unlike European powers who can partially shelter within the EU or Asian nations who can balance regional alliances, Canada has placed nearly all its eggs in the North American basket while simultaneously developing significant Chinese dependencies, Paris explains. We're now watching those strategic choices collide in real time. The G0 trap manifests most visibly in critical technology sectors where security and economics overlap. Take fifth-generation infrastructure. Canada delayed Huawei participation in its networks for years, trying to balance security concerns with economic realities, only to ultimately ban the company under intense American pressure. Now, similar dilemmas are emerging across artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and critical minerals. Canadian companies are already reporting receiving explicit ultimatums from both markets. A major Vancouver-based resource firm was recently told by Chinese partners that continued access to processing facilities would require prioritizing Chinese market interests in future contracts. Meanwhile, American defense contractors have begun requiring Canadian suppliers to certify they have minimal Chinese supply chain exposure to qualify for contracts. Individual Canadians might wonder why these seemingly abstract geopolitical tensions matter to their daily lives. The answer lies in understanding that Canada's entire economic prosperity has been built on our ability to navigate between competing powers, an approach that delivered decades of growth and stability. As that balanced approach becomes impossible, the consequences will touch everything from manufacturing jobs to pension fund returns to government service funding. What we're witnessing isn't just another economic policy adjustment. It's a fundamental reshaping of the global economic order, with Canada caught in the crossfire. This 145% tariff represents the opening salvo in a prolonged economic struggle that will transform how we work, shop, and live. For everyday Canadians, this isn't just distant economic theory anymore. The consequences are materializing in closed factories, vanishing jobs, and steadily rising prices at checkout counters across the country. Those who understand these shifting economic currents will be better positioned to navigate career choices, investment decisions, and voting priorities in this new reality of fractured global trade. Thanks for watching. What do you think about the global economic storm Canada is now caught in? Should we stand by our US alliance at any cost or start rethinking our trade future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this video helped connect the dots for you, please give it a like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding economic transformation. The 145% tariff was just the beginning. What comes next could reshape everything. See you in the next